Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm Professor Dr. Shireen Musallam, Professor of Medical Parasitology at Alexandria University. Today's lecture will deal with a disease termed Strongyloidiasis. This disease is caused by a parasite termed Strongyloidiasis circularis, and this is a roundworm belonging to phylum Nematoda and genus Strongyloides. This worm is prevalent in the tropical and the temperate areas where warmth, moisture, and poor sanitation prevail. Depending on these environmental conditions, which I have mentioned lately, this nematode leads either one of two cycles. Either it can live freely in the soil, and hence it is called a free living worm. This happens when conditions are appropriate. But once conditions are no more appropriate, it shifts to the parasitic form and it inhabits the small intestine of the host or the man. It can either lead this free living phase or this parasitic phase, or alternate between both of them according to the environmental conditions. Once inside the man, in the small intestine, the male inhabits the lumen of the small intestine, whereas the female hides itself deeply in the mucosa so that it can be prevented and it can produce its eggs. Regarding the morphology of this worm, it is a rounded worm, and the most important thing is that it is extremely small, where its parasitic type, the length of this worm never exceeds 2 to 2.5 millimeters. Let's agree for certain points which will facilitate the life cycle of this worm. Once we have sexually mature adults, these sexually mature adults, they fertilize to produce the eggs. What is the shape of the eggs of the Strongyloidiasis circularis? They are thin shelled eggs containing a partially embryonated stage. Once these eggs are produced from fertilized females, which we have said that it is located in deeply embedded in the mucosa of the small intestine, they will hatch to produce the rhabditiform larvae. These rhabditiform larvae can turn to adults through 4 divisions, and we call these divisions molts. So the transfer of rhabditiform larvae to adults, to sexually mature adults, require 4 divisions and require, of course, the favorable environmental conditions. What about these 4 molts? How do they precisely happen? They pass through 2 phases. The first 2 molts will give us the filariform larvae, or the 3rd stage filariform larvae. And the second 2 molts will shift the filariform larvae to the adult stage. And that is how the 4 molts pass through. So if the conditions are favorable, this worm can pass through 2, then another 2 molts to form the sexually mature adult. But if conditions are unfavorable, whatever things happen, for example, desiccation or something like that, it will have no facility to have 2 and then another 2 molts. So it will just pass through the first 2 molts and transfer to the filariform larvae and stop as that. This scheme will facilitate a lot the life cycle of this worm. Let's speak about the transmission of this worm. This worm can be transmitted to man through direct, indirect, or auto-infection routes. Again, we'll have just a scheme to facilitate things. In the direct and the indirect phases or routes, this worm has to pass part of its life cycle in the soil. Whereas in the auto-infection, it doesn't need the soil by any means. And we'll see later how will this happen. In the direct and the indirect cycles, the direct cycle requires just 2 divisions or 2 molts. And from now we can conclude that here in the direct cycle, the conditions are not appropriate. whereas in the indirect cycle, it will pass through 4 divisions or 4 molts, and this means that conditions are favorable in order to maturate in the soil. Let's start, or let's apply what we have just stressed on the life cycle of this worm. Starting with the direct transmission, as we said, that the sexually mature adults inhabit the small intestine. So when we are asked where is the habitat of this worm, it is present in the small intestine of man. Where exactly? The female is situated is deeply embedded within the mucosa of the small intestine. This fertilized female will start producing the eggs, and the eggs will hatch to give us the rhabditiform larvae. All of this will happen in the small intestine. The rhabditiform larvae will descend in the lumen. It will exit from the egg, and it will pass to the lumen, and it will descend with the feces of this person. When it descends, it will go to the soil. Once conditions are unfavorable, as we have said before, so it will only divide or molt twice to give us the filariform larvae, or the 3rd stage filariform larvae. Conditions are not suitable for it to perform another 2 divisions, and that's why it can't do any further division in the soil more than this stage. This 3rd stage filariform larvae are the infective stage for man. How do we take the infection, or what is the mode of infection? This comes through the skin penetration. This larva has the ability of penetrating man's skin. How's that? He could be walking bare feet on the soil. He could be sleeping on the soil with bare feet or even bare hands or something like that, so it can penetrate the intact skin. Once it pierces the skin, it will go to the circulation, of course, and the systemic circulation will send the infective larvae to the lungs. Once inside the lungs, they will penetrate the pulmonary capillaries to jump to the alveoli, and through the alveoli, they will move in a retrograde manner. They will travel up the respiratory tract to be swallowed and pass, jump to the gastrointestinal system to pass its pathway until it reaches the small intestine. There, it embeds into the mucosa, and another 2 molts happen there. Another 2 molts which are required after the first 2 molts so that it could maturate to the adult stage. And this is the direct transmission. It just descended to the soil and just transferred to the infective stage, which is the 3rd stage filariform larvae, to reinfect another man without leading a free living cycle. Let's talk about the indirect cycle. In the indirect cycle, here the first part is the same as the other one, but here soil conditions are favorable. There is moisture, and there is poor sanitation, and good temperature. And that is why all the facilities are appropriate for this worm to molt 4 times. And that's why this cycle will happen. What will happen? As I said, it will molt 4 times. What will molt 4 times? The rhabditiform larvae, which has passed to the soil from the stool of the man. Once in the soil, it will molt 4 times, and as we said, these 4 divisions will pass from the rhabditiform larvae, the first 2 to the filariform larvae, and the second 2 to the adult strongyloids. And that's why they will turn to free living adults. So free living adults, again, they will fertilize to produce the same eggs, and the eggs will hatch to produce the rhabditiform larvae, and whenever the conditions are favorable, this cycle will keep on rotating for a prolonged time until conditions are no more favorable. So it can no more divide 4 times or molt 4 times. So it has to search for a host to continue its life cycle. And this is the second part of this indirect life cycle, where conditions are no more appropriate, and that's why this this rhabditiform larvae will transfer to the filariform larvae, and it will search for a host to penetrate its skin and to continue its life cycle inside this man as a parasitic Strongyloides circularis. And that is what we call the facultative life cycle. Why do we call it a facultative life cycle or a facultative worm? This terminology is because it can lead either a free living cycle or a parasitic cycle, or it can alternate between these two cycles, and all of this is dependent on the environmental conditions. Now we'll speak about the autoinfection. And autoinfection, as we all know, the man is the source of infection for himself. What does this mean? A man needs to be infected by the filariform larvae, and only rhabditiform larvae are produced in this man. How can it turn to filariform larvae? Yes, this can happen inside man. What are the conditions that would favor this? This happens in constipated patients. During constipation, especially severe constipation, stool is retained inside the colon of this person, and that is why it will give the time, and it has all the appropriate conditions. Stool is moist, and stool retained within the colon is of good temperature. So the media is available for the transfer of the rhabditiform larvae to the filariform larvae inside the intestine. And that's why when I was telling you about the scheme which we agreed upon before dealing with the life cycles, I told you that the autoinfection doesn't need soil. Everything happens inside the body of this man. It doesn't need soil to continue its life cycle. What are the types of autoinfection that could happen? We have internal autoinfection and external autoinfection. And please don't be deceived that external autoinfection means that the rhabditiform larvae will go down to the soil to maturate. No, we'll know now. Why did we call it internal and external autoinfection? Although soil is not needed for the development. When we speak about the internal autoinfection, here the rhabditiform larvae will turn to the filariform larvae very early in the intestine, in the upper levels of the intestine. The stool is retained, and the rhabditiform larvae have the facilities for the transfer, and this happens at a higher level. So this filariform larvae will invade the intestinal mucosa. Once invading the intestinal mucosa, it will jump into the portal circulation, and at the end it will reach the lung and continue its life cycle. But when we speak about the external autoinfection, as we agreed, it will not descend into the soil. On the contrary, rhabditiform larvae will again transfer to a filariform larvae. But this time, this will happen at a later stage. What do we mean by a later stage? While passing down the bowel, and not in the upper level of the intestine, in the lower level of the intestine. And that's why they will penetrate the skin, the perineal or the perianal skin. That's why we call it external. It just exit from the anal opening and penetrated the skin, the perineal or the perianal skin. And that's why it will jump, after penetration, it will jump into the systemic circulation and not to the portal circulation. But anyway, internal or external autoinfection, both of which will reach the lung eventually, and it will continue the same life cycle we have spoken about before. Speaking about the pathogenesis of this disease, the Strongyloidiasis, as we said in the life cycle, the infective stage is the third stage filariform larvae. The mode of infection is the skin penetration, and once penetrating the skin, it will jump to the circulation. So the first stage is the cutaneous phase. Once jumping into the circulation, it will go to the lungs, and this will pass through the pulmonary phase. Finally, it will go to the intestinal phase where maturation will happen. And that's why the pathogenesis of this disease will pass through these 3 stages. Let's see each stage precisely. Speaking about the cutaneous phase, as we said, that this man is walking bare feet on an infected soil, on a soil which is contaminated with the stool of an infected man. Okay? And that's why larvae, which are running all around in the soil, have the facilities to penetrate this intact skin. It doesn't need a wound to enter. No, it can penetrate the intact skin. Once penetrating the intact skin, it will disseminate and it will move through the layers of the skin. As we can see here, it can move within the layers of the skin and it will induce an inflammatory reaction inside the skin layers. This is the penetrating rhabditiform larvae migrating through the skin of this person. And this is the cutaneous phase. What about the pulmonary phase? As we said, after penetrating the skin, it will pass through the circulation and it will go to the lungs. In the lungs, it will penetrate the pulmonary capillaries to enter to the alveoli. And then it will keep on wandering through the air passages upwards or in a retrograde manner throughout the whole pulmonary pathways. And that's why once it is present there, it is a foreign body. And foreign bodies evoke or stimulate immune response. And this is the figure here with the pulmonary tissues, which were supposed to be filled with air spaces, but the case is different here. Here, larvae are inducing cut sections in larvae, which are inducing inflammatory reaction and, of course, exudate. And this will affect the lung, and you will see the impact of these pathogenic stages on the clinical picture. The impact of the disease in the lung is caused mainly by the filariform larvae or the migratory larvae. The migratory larvae here are the filariform larvae. So the cutaneous phase and the pulmonary phases, both of which are caused by the penetrating and the migratory filariform larvae. The final pathogenic stage is in the intestine. And as we have said that the habitat of this worm, once maturated, is the deep intestinal mucosa, the deep small intestinal mucosa. As we said, that the worm embeds itself, especially the female fertilized worm embeds itself in the mucosa, and part of which is just only protruding into the lumen. Once inside the mucosa, as we can see here, it is producing the eggs. So foreign adults in large number, together with its producing eggs, are present in the mucosa, in the intestinal mucosa. This presence will hinder the normal function of the intestine, and this will lead to what we call strongyloids enteropathy. Strongyloids enteropathy. This is an interruption of the normal function of the small intestine. And strongyloids enteropathy will lead to malabsorption, of course, of fats and vitamin B12 and protein, what you call protein losing enteropathy. Protein will not be absorbed and it will descend with the stool, and this person will suffer the consequences of this malabsorption. You will see, of course, the impact of all these pathogenic stages in the clinical picture. The worst thing that could happen is the sloughing of the intestinal mucosa. The presence of the adult worm in the mucosa and its penetrating effect and its production of a number of eggs and the exit of these eggs from the intestinal mucosa, all of this will affect this fragile mucosa, leading to sloughing and mucosal ulceration with the later consequences. We have a very important syndrome linked to the Strongyloides torricularis, which we call hyperinfection. And hyperinfection is an augmented, persistent form of strongyloidiasis. Does this happen in everyone? No. What is it dependent on? It depends on the immune system of the host. We always say that there is a balance between the parasites and the immune system of the host. Once there is a balance between these two sides, the disease will pass without serious damage. It will manifest, but without serious damage. But once the immune system of this person is lowered by any immunosuppressing cause, whether immunosuppressing disease or immunosuppressing drug, this person will have the hyperinfection syndrome. It is a persistent form of infection. It is an augmented form of infection. This will cause the production of larvae to be uncontrolled. This massive production of the larvae will lead up to flaring up of the infection in an uncontrolled manner. What do we mean by an uncontrolled manner? We mean that the infection will no more be restricted to the root it is used to. It will go to other organs. It will disseminate, and it will perform in another manner. Let's see. As we said, the larvae here are not under control. Immune system is no more controlling them. That's why it will disseminate throughout all the tissues of the body. And this is what we call visceral larva migrans. And from its name, the larvae will migrate to different viscera. It will not be restricted to the normal route, which is from the intestine to the pulmonary tissues. From the pulmonary tissue to the intestine. No, it will disseminate. It will disseminate to different organs. And of course, the manifestations will be linked to the type of organ that it will go to. During this migration, the larvae will go to the lung. And this is normal. We agreed that migratory larvae or migratory filariform larvae pass to the lung, but they pass just as a migratory phase. But in this case, in hyperinfection, once they go there in magnificent amount, they will induce severe host infection and not a mild host infection. This augmented host infection can cause a delay of the passage of the filariform larvae. They can retain the larvae inside the pulmonary tissues and prevent any further migrations there. So what is the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that the larvae will be obliged to complete its life cycle inside the lungs. It will no more respect its normal life cycle. It will not wait to go to the intestine to continue the other two molds to develop into sexually mature adults. On the contrary, mature adults will be produced in the lung. And this is a great problem because this will completely destroy the pulmonary tissues, and they will act as if this is the habitat, and it will start producing eggs, and eggs will start to hatch to form rhabditiform larvae, and rhabditiform larvae will divide twice to form the filariform larvae, and so on. The whole life cycle in the hyperinfection will take place in the lungs, leading to complete destruction of the pulmonary tissues.